The night was cold, sharp winds carrying the sound of coyotes across the lonely plains. The moon hung low over the desert, pale light touching the jagged rocks and endless stretches of sand. The old land seemed alive, holding whispers of battles fought long before, of people who had walked these trails with pride and pain. Somewhere in that silence, a figure stumbled forward, weary and alone, an outsider who did not belong to this unforgiving world. Every step seemed heavier than the last, and yet something stronger than fear kept her moving. She had no choice but to keep going, though every shadow reminded her she was being watched. The settlement behind her had cast her out, their voices filled with anger and suspicion. To them, she was different, a stranger who carried secrets they could not understand. In those rough days, being an outsider meant being seen as a threat. They had no mercy for weakness, no patience for someone who could not be bent to their ways. Rumors spread quickly in small communities, and soon those whispers grew sharp enough to wound. She had been handed over to a fate worse than exile, a punishment meant to silence her forever. Out there in the wild, wolves waited. Their cries rose in the distance, fierce and hungry, echoing through the canyons. The people who had turned their backs on her did not need to swing a rope or raise a weapon. They simply let the wilderness finish what they had begun. To them, it was justice. To her, it was terror. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering not only from the cold but from the dread curling in her chest. The thought of sharp teeth and glowing eyes closing in on her was almost too much to bear. Yet she was still breathing, still walking, still clinging to the smallest spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, she would find a way to survive. The land itself offered no comfort. Dry grass whispered against her skirt, and dust clung to her shoes with every step. She could smell the sagebrush in the wind, sharp and earthy, mixing with the faint copper temps of fear on her lips. She remembered the eyes of the townsfolk as they watched her leave, some filled with cold triumph, others with uneasy silence. No one had stepped forward to defend her. No one had questioned the choice to send her out. She was already gone to them, erased from their world. That thought cut deeper than the cold. Still, the human heart has its own stubborn will. She had lived through storms, loss, and betrayal, and though the night pressed hard against her, she refused to give it her soul. The sound of the wolves drew closer, their howls a reminder of how little time she had. Her pulse raced, hands trembling as she searched the shadows for a weapon, a rock, a branch, anything to defend herself. The silence between their calls was worse than the cries themselves. In that emptiness, she knew they were drawing in tighter, circling unseen. But fate does not always move in a straight line. It's just when the weight of fear threatened to crush her, another presence stirred in the dark. From the edge of the cliffs, hidden by the shape of the land, he had been watching. A tall figure, strong in form, his eyes trained on her every step. He belonged to the earth in a way she never could, moving with the quiet grace of one who had been shaped by its winds and fires. He was Apache, a warrior whose blood carried generations of survival, a man whose silence spoke more than any word. The warrior had no reason to intervene. To him, she was not of his people, not tied to his traditions or his fight. She was part of the same world that had pushed his kin to the edges, a world that took and took until there was little left. Yet something in her stumbling steps caught him, something in the way she looked around, not with arrogance, but with desperate will to live. In her struggle, he saw not an enemy, but a fragile piece of humanity fighting to survive in a land that swallowed the weak whole. The wolves knew nothing of mercy. Their howls shifted into low growls now, coming from different sides. Shadows moved along the ridges, their bodies slipping like ghosts against the pale rock. The outsider stopped, breathing hard, her chest rising and falling as she realized the circle had closed around her. Her eyes darted wildly, but the world gave her no escape. She felt the air grow thick, heavy with the nearness of the hunt. From the cliff above, the warrior drew his breath steady. His bow rested in his hand, the string taut, the arrow tipped with sharpened stone, glinting faintly in the moonlight. He knew the ways of wolves, their hunger and their cunning. He also knew the cruelty of people who cast others into such a fate. What lay before him was more than a choice. It was a test of spirit, of the old teachings that said every life carried worth. He could leave her to the wilderness as they intended, or he could step into her story, forever changing both of their paths. She did not know he was there, her hands clenched into fists, her voice trembling as she whispered into the night, a prayer to any power that might hear. Her legs felt weak, but she stood her ground, because running would only make the chase quicker. She thought of her past, the pieces of her life she had lost, the hope she still clung to. She was not ready to give that up, even if no one else believed in her. The first pair of glowing eyes appeared in the brush, low and unblinking. Another set followed, then another, until the night seemed alive with them. The growls deepened, rumbling like thunder building in the distance. Her breath caught, tears stinging her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. The wolves were close enough now that she could hear their paws crunching against the dry ground. Her heart pounded so loud it drowned out every other sound. Up on the ridge, the Apache warrior shifted his stance, silent as stone, yet alive with purpose. He had waited long enough, seen enough. The choice pressed heavy upon him, but his spirit knew what had to be done. His hand tightened on the bowstring, his breath slow, his eyes fixed on the shadow that lunged first. The outsider gasped, her body frozen as the wolf sprang from the darkness, teeth bared, its leap fast and merciless. Time seemed to stop, the moment stretching thin, filled with dread and the raw will to live. She raised her arm as if it could shield her, a small and hopeless gesture against such fury. Then a sharp sound split the night, the hiss of an arrow cutting through the air with deadly precision. The wolf yelped, its body twisting mid-lep before it crashed to the ground just short of her feet. The circle of glowing eyes shifted, confusion breaking their rhythm. The outsider's breath broke in a cry, her knees nearly giving way as she stared down at the fallen beast. And then she looked up, following the path of that arrow, to the ridge where a figure now stood tall against the pale moon. His outline was strong, fierce, unshaken. She could not see his face, only the glint of his weapon and the certainty in his stance. For a heartbeat, she did not know if she was saved or facing another danger. The wolves growled low, restless now, uncertain in the presence of a predator greater than themselves. The night hung heavy with silence, waiting for the next move. The outsider's heart raced, torn between fear and fragile hope. The warrior remained still, an unspoken promise hanging in the air. And in that moment, on the edge of life and death, everything changed. Though neither of them yet knew how, the wind carried the sound of the wounded wolf's cry far into the canyon, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to pause. The other wolves stepped back, their yellow eyes flickering with both hunger and hesitation. They were creatures of instinct, but even instinct bends when danger greater than prey presents itself. The outsider stood frozen in place, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her legs trembling beneath her weight. She had never been so close to death before, never so sure that the next heartbeat would be her last. Her eyes lifted toward the ridge where the warrior stood. He did not move, his form etched against the moonlight like some figure carved from the earth itself. She could not see his expression, only the steadiness of his bow and the sense of quiet power that seemed to roll from him. Something inside her shifted, caught between disbelief and awe. For hours, she had been certain no one cared whether she lived or died. Now, in the very moment she had been handed over to the wolves, a stranger had chosen to interfere. The wolves began circling again, uneasy, testing the air. Their hunger fought against their fear, and the air grew thick with tension. The outsider backed up a single step, her body weak but her will alive. She glanced toward the ridge again, silently begging for another arrow, another sign that she was not alone. The warrior lowered the bow for just a moment and moved with purpose along the ridge, his feet sure and silent. He descended toward her, his body blending with the shadows as if the land itself guided his steps. The wolves followed his movement with their glowing eyes, snarling low, but holding their distance. The outsider watched as he approached, each stride firm, his presence commanding without a word spoken. She had heard stories of the Apache, whispers in the settlement filled with both fear and admiration. Yet none of those words prepared her for the sight of this man, alive and unyielding, stepping out of the darkness like a force of nature. Her heart pounded as he drew near. She wondered if she was trading one danger for another, but there was no time to dwell on it. The wolves began to close in again, restless and unwilling to let their prey slip away. The warrior's hand moved swiftly, another arrow notched and drawn with effortless strength. The string sang as he released, and another wolf fell, breaking the circle. The others scattered back into the brush, growls echoing before fading into the distance. Silence followed, The outsider sank to her knees, her body giving in to the exhaustion that had been building all night. The warrior stopped a few paces away from her, his bow still in hand. His eyes fixed on her with the sharpness of one who trusted nothing too quickly. She raised her gaze to meet his, words caught in her throat. For the first time since she had been cast out, she felt a flicker of safety, though it was tempered with uncertainty. He said nothing at first, only watching her as though trying to decide what manner of soul she carried. She wanted to speak, to thank him, to explain, but the weight of the night pressed on her chest like a stone. Instead, she managed a single whisper, her voice raw from fear and cold. "Why did you help me?" The warrior tilted his head slightly, his face unreadable in the dim light. For a long moment, he gave no answer. Then, with a voice low and steady, he spoke. "No one should be given to the wolves." Those words struck her deeper than she expected. They were simple, but within them carried a truth older than both of them. She lowered her eyes, her thoughts heavy with what had brought her to this moment. The people she had trusted had turned her away, casting her into the wild without care. Yet here, a stranger of another world entirely, had chosen to see her worth enough to step in. He extended a hand toward her. At first she hesitated, unsure if she should take it. But as the night stretched on, she realized she had no strength left to stand on her own. Slowly, she placed her hand in his, and he pulled her to her feet with ease. His grip was strong, but not unkind, his presence steady like the earth beneath her feet. As they stood together, the howls of the wolves returned in the distance, reminding them both that the danger was far from over. The warrior's eyes shifted toward the dark hills, and he nodded slightly. "We cannot stay here." She swallowed hard, nodding in return. Her legs wavered, but she forced herself to move as he guided her toward the shelter of the rocks. Every step carried a weight of exhaustion, yet there was also something new beneath it, a small spark of trust in the man walking beside her. She wondered why he had chosen to intervene, what it meant, and whether she could ever repay him. The path he led her on wound through jagged stone, the moonlight barely touching the ground. He moved with certainty, his steps silent, as if he knew every shift of the land. She tried to keep pace, though her breath came ragged, and her body cried for rest. The silence between them was heavy but not empty. It was filled with unspoken questions, with the raw tension of two lives crossing in a moment neither had planned. She thought back to the settlement, to the faces of those who had cast her away. They had spoken of her as though she were a danger, as though she carried something that could not be trusted. She had tried to defend herself, but their fear was stronger than any word she offered. They had chosen the old way of punishment, not with rope or fire, but with the wilderness. Her heart ached as she remembered the betrayal, but she pushed the thoughts aside, focusing instead on the steady presence of the man before her. He finally paused beneath an overhang of stone, a place hidden from the open sky. There he motioned for her to rest, and she sank down against the rock, her body heavy with exhaustion. The warrior remained standing, his eyes scanning the dark, as though he could see what lay beyond the reach of the moonlight. She watched him in silence, the lines of his figure sharp against the pale glow, the quiet strength in his stance undeniable. For a while, neither spoke. The night carried only the distant cries of wolves and the whisper of the wind. Then she found her voice, soft but steady. "You saved me when no one else would. I don't even know your name." He looked at her, his eyes unreadable, and after a long pause he answered, "Names are not given icily, but you may call me what you need." There was something in his words that held both a distance and closeness, as if he had drawn a line she was not meant to cross, yet offered her a place of safety within it. She nodded slowly, respecting the weight of his silence. She did not press further, though her heart longed to know more of him. The hours dragged on, the cold creeping deeper into her bones. She pulled her arms tight around herself, shivering in the shadows. The warrior noticed and shifted closer, pulling a piece of heavy cloth from his pack and handing it to her. She hesitated before taking it, surprised by the small act of kindness. The cloth carried the scent of smoke and earth, grounding her in a way she had not expected. She wrapped it around her shoulders, the warmth seeping slowly into her. Her eyes grew heavy, yet she fought against the pull of sleep. She was afraid that if she closed her eyes, the wolves would return, or the warrior might vanish like a dream. But exhaustion is stronger than fear, and soon her head leaned against the rock, her body giving in. The last thing she saw before sleep took her was the warrior standing watch, his bow in hand, his gaze never wavering. The land held its silence, but danger was never far. The shadows beyond their shelter, eyes still lingered, waiting. The wilderness was not finished with them, and neither was the story that had brought her here. Somewhere in the distance, the faint glow of dawn began to touch the horizon, but with it came no promise of peace. Only the weight of choices yet to be made, and the mystery of why fate had crossed their paths at the edge of death. And as the first light of day crept into the sky, the outsider and the Apache warrior stood at the beginning of something neither yet understood, caught between a world that had cast her out and a wilderness that demanded more than either of them might be ready to give. The first gray light of morning spread across the desert, chasing away the cold shadows of the night. The outsider stirred, her body aching as she woke against the rough stone wall of the overhang. For a moment she forgot where she was until the sound of movement nearby pulled her back. The Apache warrior stood only a few paces away, his bow still close, his eyes fixed on the horizon as though the land itself whispered its secrets to him. She pushed herself upright, her body stiff, her throat dry. The memory of the wolves rushed back to her, sharp and vivid. Her chest tightened at the thought of how close she had come to death. But the sight of the warrior still watching over her grounded her again. He had not left her. Alone was enough to keep her moving. The land around them was quiet, but the quiet was not peace. It was a silence that held weight, a silence that carried unseen threats. The outsider could feel it pressing down on her as though the very earth questioned her presence. She glanced at the warrior, wondering what thoughts lay behind his sharp gaze. He had saved her, but she could not tell if he had done it for her sake, or simply to defy the cruelty of the ones who had cast her out. Her stomach ached with hunger, a reminder that she had eaten little before the night's ordeal. She looked around, searching for anything that might serve as food, but the desert offered little. The warrior seemed to notice. Without a word, he crouched near the brush and pulled a small bundle from his pack. Inside was dried meat and roots, simple, but enough to quiet the hunger. He placed it before her without ceremony. She whispered her thanks, her voice still weak, and ate slowly, each bite steadying her. As the sun rose higher, painting the rocks with gold, the warrior finally spoke. "The wolves will not be the only danger. You are hunted by more than teeth and claws." She stiffened at his words, her heart beating faster. "You mean the people who sent me out?" He nodded once, his expression grave. "When a community casts someone away, they do not expect her to return. To them, you are gone. They learn you survived, they may come for you again." The thought sank into her like cold water. She had known it, deep down, but hearing it spoken aloud gave it a weight that nearly crushed her. She wrapped the cloth he had given her tighter around her shoulders and stared at the ground. "I didn't ask for any of this, never wanted to be their enemy." The warrior studied her, his silence heavy, then asked, "Why did they fear you?" Her eyes burned with memories she wished she could forget. She shook her head slowly, hesitant to speak. "Because I was different. Because I questioned things they wanted to believe. Because I didn't fit into the life they wanted me to live." Her voice cracked as she forced the words out. "And once suspicion takes root, it doesn't matter what you say. You're already guilty in their eyes." The warrior's gaze softened for just a moment, as though her words touched something he understood. Then he looked away, scanning the horizon once more. "The earth is full of such cruelty," he said. "Your people are not the only ones who cast out those who do not bend." The outsider wanted to ask what he meant, but she sensed his words came from wounds of his own, and she did not press further. Instead, she followed his lead when he began moving again, guiding her through the rough paths of the desert. As they traveled, the land revealed itself in harsh beauty. Red cliffs towered over them, their faces scarred by time and weather. Dry riverbeds cut across the earth, reminders of storms that had once roared through. The sun burned overhead, and though the warrior moved with ease, every step was a trial for her. Yet she pushed forward, refusing to show weakness. By midday, they came upon signs of life. The tracks of horses in the dust, the faint remains of a campfire long since abandoned. The warrior crouched, studying the ground with sharp eyes, his jaw tightened. Riders passed here not long ago. Too many. Her heart clenched. Do you think they're searching for me? He did not answer at once, but the shadow that crossed his face was enough. It is possible. Or they search for me. Either way, we must move carefully. The thought of being hunted by both wolves and men twisted fear inside her chest. She thought of the riders from her settlement, their hard eyes, their voices sharp with judgment. They had once been neighbors, people she had shared work and meals with. Now they were hunters, and she was the prey. The warrior led her into the shelter of the rocks, his movements quick and sure. The air grew heavy with tension, and every sound seemed sharper, every shadow deeper. They walked until the sun dipped low again, painting the world in fire. Only then did he allow them to rest, hidden among the jagged cliffs. That night, as the fire crackled softly between them, she found the courage to ask the question that had been pressing on her heart. Why did you choose to save me? You don't even know me. The warrior sat in silence for a long time, his eyes fixed on the flames. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. Because I have seen too many lives taken for no reason. Because I know the weight of being hunted. And because something in your eyes told me you were not ready to die. His words lingered in the air, heavy with truth. She studied him, wondering about the life he carried, the battles that had shaped him. He was a man apart, much like herself, bound by a world that did not forgive differences. And yet, in their shared exile, there was a strange bond forming, fragile but undeniable. Still, the dangers did not rest. In the distance, the howl of wolves rose once more, followed by something deeper, the faint echo of horse hooves on hard ground. Her heart clenched as she realized the riders might be drawing closer. As she looked at the warrior, her fear plain in her eyes. He did not flinch. Instead, he reached for his bow, his voice calm but firm. They will not find us easily, but if they do, you must be ready. Your life is no longer something you can leave in the hands of others. You must fight for it, as I do. His words struck her with both fear and strength. She had never thought of herself as someone who could fight, but perhaps that was what survival demanded now.
Ow.
The fire burned low as the night deepened, but neither of them slept easily. The land carried too much danger, too much silence broken only by the whispers of pursuit. The outsider lay awake, staring at the stars above, wondering what tomorrow would bring. The warrior kept watch, his figure steady against the shifting light. And somewhere beyond the cliffs, riders moved through the dark. Their voices carried faintly on the wind, their search growing closer with each passing hour. The wilderness held its breath, waiting for the moment when all paths would collide. The outsider knew her story was far from over. She had been cast out, left to die, but fate had tied her life to a stranger whose presence carried both mystery and strength. Together, they walked a narrow path between survival and danger, their choices shaping a future neither of them could yet see. The wolves had been only the beginning. True hunt was still ahead. The night wore on, the fire's glow flickering faintly against the jagged cliffs. The outsider could not rest, her mind racing with every sound carried on the wind. She felt the danger pressing closer, like a shadow creeping steadily across her path. She had thought the wolves were the end of her fear, but the knowledge that men were hunting her weighed heavier. Wolves killed for hunger. Men killed for pride, revenge, or silence. The Apache warrior remained steady at her side, his back straight, his bow never far from his reach. He spoke little, but his presence carried a strength that steadied her, even when her body trembled with uncertainty. She had begun to trust him more than she trusted her own instincts. Yet questions gnawed at her. Who exactly was this man? Why had fate led their paths to cross in the wild at the exact moment she needed saving? As dawn broke, the horizon burned red with light. The warrior motioned for her to rise, and they began moving again. Their journey carried them through dry ravines and over rocky ridges, always keeping to the hidden paths where eyes from afar could not see. She tried to keep up, though her body ached with every step. The warrior never slowed, but when she stumbled, his hand was there, firm and steady, guiding her without a word. By midday, they reached higher ground. From there, the land stretched wide, a mix of dust, stone, and scattered brush. In the distance, faint trails of dust curled into the sky. Riders. The warrior crouched low, his eyes narrowing. He did not speak, but she saw the way his jaw tightened. The riders were searching, weaving across the land like hunters following scent. Her heart pounded as she realized they were not far off, and the desert offered little cover. The warrior led her down into a narrow canyon, the walls high and the shadows deep. It was cooler there, the sound of their steps echoing softly off the stone. For a while it felt like safety, but the outsider could not shake the fear that the riders would find them. She whispered, her voice trembling. "They will not stop, will they?" The warrior glanced back, his eyes calm, though his words were grave. "No, they will follow until they are certain. Men do not rest when they believe their honor is at stake." She lowered her eyes, thinking of the settlement, of the voices that had cast her out. Now they had called her dangerous, unfit, a burden. But deep inside she knew there was more to their decision. Someone had feared her truth, something she knew, something she might reveal. That fear had been enough to mark her as an outsider, and now it seemed they would rather see her dead than risk her return. The canyon twisted deeper, the walls pressing close. The air grew still, and with it came a silence that set her nerves on edge. The warrior slowed, his hand raised for her to stop. He pressed his ear to the stone, listening. She held her breath, her heart racing as she waited. Then, faint at first, but growing clearer, came the sound of hooves above, the clatter of horses moving along the canyon rim. The outsider's pulse hammered in her throat. She pressed against the wall, every muscle tense, praying they would not be seen. Dust trickled down from above, small stones shifting loose. She dared not move, hardly dared to breathe. The riders' voices drifted down, sharp and rough, calling to one another as they searched. She could not understand all the words, but the tone was clear. They were hunting with determination, and she was the prey they would not give up on. The warrior motioned for her to follow him deeper still, moving with the silence of one who had lived his life in such moments. They slipped through the shadows, careful not to let sound betray them. But the canyon grew narrower, the path tighter, until the walls pressed so close they were forced to stop. The warrior's eyes scanned the stone, searching, and then he found what he needed. A narrow crevice, nearly hidden, just wide enough for them to squeeze through. He guided her inside, pressing her back against the cool stone as the sound of riders passed overhead. The air inside was tight and close, the darkness heavy. She could feel her breath catch, her fear threatening to choke her, but the warrior's steady hand on her shoulder anchored her. They stood there in silence, listening as the horses' hooves clattered above. For a long moment, it seemed they might be safe. Then a stone clattered down into the canyon, striking hard against the ground. One of the riders shouted, his voice cutting sharp through the air. Another answered, and then the sound of horses reined in tight filled the canyon. The outsider's stomach turned to ice. They had seen something. They were not safe. The warrior's eyes met hers in the dark, calm but sharp. He whispered low, his voice like steel. "They find us, you must do as I say. Do not hesitate." Her throat tightened, but she nodded. She had no other choice. The shouts grew closer, and soon the sound of boots on stone echoed in the canyon. The riders were dismounting, spreading out, their voices growing clearer. She could hear them calling, searching, certain their prey was close. The warrior shifted, his bow in hand, his movements quiet but filled with intent. The outsider's chest rose and fell with sharp breaths as the sound of footsteps came nearer, echoing against the canyon walls. The moment stretched like a blade drawn thin. She could hear the riders now, just beyond the narrow crack where they hid. One of them laughed, a cruel sound that made her blood run cold. Another muttered, his tone sharp with certainty. They were closing in. The warrior's eyes never left the narrow gap of light. His muscles were taut, ready, his stance silent but unyielding. She watched him, fear and awe warring inside her. He was not afraid, not in the way she was. He was something else, something forged by the land and the battles it demanded. The sound of boots struck close now, stones scattering. A shadow moved across the crack of light. Someone was there, only a step away. The outsider held her breath, her heart hammering so loud she thought it would give them away. The shadow shifted, leaning closer, a voice calling out to the others. She could not understand the words, but she knew the meaning. They had found something. The warrior raised his bow, slow and steady, his breath even. Time seemed to slow around her, the tension so sharp it burned in her chest. She knew the next moment could shatter everything. Then a shout rang out, louder than the rest, followed by the scrape of boots as more men gathered. The riders were no longer searching blindly. They had cornered their prey. The outsider pressed herself against the stone, her body trembling, her eyes wide as she looked to the warrior. He stood ready, his figure framed by the faint light, a wall of calm strength against the storm building outside. She felt the air grow tight, every sound magnified, every breath stretched thin. The riders were closing in. The canyon walls left no way out. The wolves had been only the beginning. Now the true danger had arrived, and it was human. The outsider knew the moment had come when survival would demand more than fear. And as the first boot struck, the stone just beyond their hiding place, the air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the clash that was about to erupt. The sound of boots scraped against the stone, echoing like thunder inside the canyon. The outsider's heart pounded so loudly she thought it might betray her, yet she forced herself to stay still, pressed into the narrow crevice of rock. The Apache warrior stood before her, his bow drawn, his entire body coiled with steady strength. He did not tremble, did not falter. In that moment he looked like a figure carved from the earth itself, a man bound to something older and stronger than fear. A shadow passed close, too close, and a rough voice called out to the others. Then another answered and more footsteps followed. The riders had found their trail. The air seemed to thicken, the silence before the storm stretching thin. The outsider gripped the cloth around her shoulders tighter, bracing for what was to come. When the first man leaned into the crack of stone, the warrior loosed his arrow. It struck with swift precision, the cry of surprise cut short. Chaos erupted in the canyon, shouts echoing off the walls, boots pounding against stone. The warrior pulled her out from the crevice, his hand firm on her arm as he guided her quickly into the open. The riders surged forward, their weapons flashing in the early light, but the warrior stood between her and them, his bows singing again, another arrow cutting through the air. The outsider stumbled, but kept moving as he urged her on, her legs burning with fear and desperation. She had never known such terror, yet in the midst of it she clung to the certainty that he would not leave her behind. They ran along the canyon floor, stones scattering beneath their steps, the shouts of riders rising behind them. The warrior shifted to cover her, each arrow he loosed, slowing their pursuers, his movements fluid and unshaken. At last, they reached the end of the canyon, where the walls opened into wild country once more. The warrior paused, listening, his breath steady, though his eyes were sharp with focus. The riders had slowed, regrouping in the canyon, their voices distant now. They would not give up, but for the moment the two of them had broken free. The outsider collapsed against a rock, her chest heaving. She looked at the warrior, awe in her eyes, though her voice trembled. "You fought them for me. You could have left me, and no one would have blamed you." He studied her for a long moment, his face calm, though his eyes held a depth she could not read. "You were handed over to the wolves because fear made them blind. I have seen too much of that blindness in this land. I would not let it take you to." His words settled deep into her chest, cutting through the fear with a warmth she had not felt in a long time. She nodded slowly, unable to find words that could match the weight of his choice. They moved on, guided by his sure knowledge of the land. Days passed, each one heavy with the tension of pursuit. Sometimes they caught sight of riders far in the distance, dust rising in the sun. But the warrior always led them through hidden paths, across ridges and into valleys where no trail remained. The outsider grew stronger with each step, her fear tempered by determination. Hunger and exhaustion still pressed her, but she carried on, knowing her life now depended on her own will as much as his protection. One evening, as the sun sank low, they found shelter by a stream tucked deep within the rocks. The sound of water was like a blessing, and for the first time since her exile, she felt the weight of survival ease from her shoulders. She sat at the stream's edge, cupping the water in her hands, watching the ripples shimmer in the fading light. The warrior stood nearby, silent as always, but there was something softer in the way he looked at the land around them. Yes, as though he, too, felt the small peace of the moment. She broke the silence, her voice steady, though her heart was full. "I don't know what waits for me now. I have no home to return to, no place that will welcome me." The warrior crouched near the water, his reflection rippling with the current. A home is not given by others, is made by your own hands, your own spirit. If they cast you out, then you must find a place where your heart can be free. His words struck her, simple yet profound. She realized then that he, too, carried the weight of exile. Though he was strong and proud, he was also a man whose world had been pushed aside. His people had been forced to walk paths of survival against the tide of change. In him she saw not only the warrior who had saved her, but also a soul who understood what it meant to be marked as an outsider. The days that followed were filled with quiet understanding. She learned to move more silently, to notice the signs of the land as he did. He taught her how to find roots beneath the earth, how to follow the stars when the path seemed lost. In return, she shared pieces of her story, the moments of her past that had led her to the settlement, the small hope she had once held for a future that was now gone. He did not judge her, simply listened, and in that listening, she felt the first stirrings of belonging. But danger was never far. One morning, the distant thunder of hooves carried across the plains. The riders had not abandoned their hunt. They had tracked and searched, and now they were closing in once more. The warrior's face hardened, his bow already in hand. The outsider felt the fear return, but it was no longer the same paralyzing dread. She had learned something new: courage. They moved swiftly, climbing higher ground where the rocks gave them advantage. The riders' shouts grew nearer, the clash building again, louder than before. This time the outsider did not hide behind him. She picked up a stone, her hands trembling, but her spirit firm. She was no longer the same woman who had been handed to the wilderness as prey. She had walked through fear and found something stronger inside her. As the riders drew close, the air filled with tension sharper than any blade. The warrior stood tall, his bow raised, his presence unshaken. Outs! The outsider stood beside him, her breath steady, her will alive. They faced the coming storm together, no longer just two souls bound by chance, but two who had chosen to fight against the weight of a world that sought to break them. When the clash came, it was fierce. The riders charged, their voices harsh, their anger burning like fire. The warrior moved with the grace of the land itself, his arrows finding their mark, his spirit unyielding. The outsider fought as best she could, her hands raw, her body shaking, but her courage carrying her through. She realized in those moments that survival was not only about strength of body, but also about strength of heart. The battle raged under the wide sky, dust rising, cries echoing through the rocks. The outsider's mind was a blur of fear and determination, her eyes fixed on the figure of the warrior who had become more than just her protector. Together they stood against the storm, and though the outcome was uncertain, she felt something she had not felt in a long time: hope. The dust began to settle, the cries fading into the distance. Silence stretched across the land once more, broken only by the sound of her breath and the steady beat of her heart. The warrior lowered his bow, his chest rising and falling, his eyes scanning the horizon. They were still standing, they were still alive. The outsider sank to her knees, her body weak with exhaustion, but her spirit unbroken. She lifted her eyes to the warrior, and in his gaze she saw more than strength. She saw a reflection of her own survival, her own will to live. The wilderness had tested her, the wolves had circled, the riders had hunted, but she was still here. She was no longer the woman cast out in shame and fear. She was someone who had walked through the fire of exile and found a new path, a new strength. The warrior's voice broke the silence, calm and steady. The land does not decide who belongs. The heart does. She nodded, her chest full with gratitude and something more, a sense of belonging she had thought lost forever. The desert stretched wide before them, harsh and unforgiving, yet filled with promise. She did not know where the road would lead, but she knew she would not walk it alone. Together, they turned toward the horizon, the rising sun painting the land in light. The story of the outsider and the Apache warrior was not one of endings, but of beginnings born from survival, from courage, and from the choice to stand when the world tried to break them. And as they walked forward, the echoes of fear faded behind them, placed by the quiet strength of two souls who had found not only each other, but also the truth, that even in the harshest wilderness, hope could take root.